Imagine a blind former police officer standing before a courtroom with his devoted canine guide dog by his side. The atmosphere is tense, and everyone is anticipating his last remarks. But his dog unexpectedly reacts in a way that nobody could have expected the trial to take a startling turn. This is a tale of faith. Watch to see how a blind guy's faith in his intuition and the unique link between a man and his dog. Partner reveals that the courtroom was a scene of hushed whispers and quick looks as Jack Sullivan moved with purpose and assurance. Jack, a former police officer, was acknowledged as one of the city's most accomplished investigators. But after suffering an unfathomable blow from life, he lost his sight. Despite this, Jack's attendance was ordered in an accident during his most recent case. Following his manner, steadfastly walking next to him was Max, his devoted German shepherd, who had become Jack's trusty guide dog after serving as a canine officer, and their relationship had deepened even further Max was more than simply Jack's eyes in the years after his retirement. He was also his guardian, his dependable friend, and the one was that Jack could always count on him. However, Jack's life had taken a tragic turn, and he was currently being tried for a serious crime. There were differing views on the case, with many people finding it difficult to connect the charges with Today, the trial had reached a crucial point in the distinguished officer's reputation. Jack had asked for Max's permission to appear in court, not only as his guide, but also because he thought his dog might be the key. The judge, a strict but fair woman, accepted his motion with a "Mr. Sullivan," she started with a hint of doubt. "This is an exceptional allowance. I have faith that you will clarify the significance of your request." "Thank you, Your Honor," Jack answered in a steady but somewhat. "Max is more than simply a dog. We have experienced everything together." Max led Jack to his seat, "And I trust his senses above all else since he is my partner." The dog's keen eyes looked around the room, his nose twitching a little. As everyone watched Jack reach down, the courtroom went silent. Stroking Max's back in a reassuring gesture before it occurred, Max, who was typically composed and calmly tensed, his eyes latching on a man as a deep growl rumbled in his throat. Jack was sitting at the prosecutor's table when the unexpected response sent shockwaves through the room. Inclined his face gravely, Max, he whispered, his voice asking the dogs. There was an undercurrent of tension throughout the courtroom, and Max realized that the behavior wasn't random, but rather intentional. The silence was broken by Max's sudden growl, and Jack's fingers automatically tightened on the leash as he sensed his dogs. The judge's remarkable awareness caused her to delicately wrap her gavel and call for order. Judge Sullivan's voice grew softer, but still concerned. "Could you tell me what's going on with your dog?" Jack paused. "Your Honor, Max is taught to recognize danger, but he has never acted in this way without cause, and I believe his intuition." The courtroom exchanged nervous looks, and the prosecutor, "Mr. With all due respect to Your Honor," Langston remarked, grinning as he stood. "Judge, are we seriously letting a dog's snarl influence court proceedings?" Jack raised his head in front of his blind eyes. "Max has saved my life more times than I can remember," he stated firmly, adding that if he's reacting, it's because. Max's snarl turned into a low whimper, his body stiff. Something's wrong. He kept his eyes on a man in a sharp gray suit who was seated a few seats behind the prosecution table, uncomfortably under the dog's direct observation. The judge looked at the man with interest and said, "Sir, you want to contribute something, man?" Stunned by the attention, he muttered, No, Your Honor, I'm Justin." Jack, an observer who appeared to have attracted the attention of a highly skilled canine, interrupted his quiet but. Immediately, the courtroom became quiet once more, the atmosphere heavy with interest and anxiety. Anyone familiar with Jack's career knew that Max had been trained to work as a police officer, thus his past was not a mystery. Identified drugs, explosives, and even human emotions like hostility and fear. Years of intense training and field work had sharpened Jack's instincts, and he understood that Max's response wasn't. The prosecutor attempted to refocus attention by using an arbitrary signal. "Let's not." Losing focus on the current issue, he stated that Mr. Sullivan is on trial for tampering with evidence and obstructing justice. There is no time to be distracted by what a dog might or may not have detected, so Jack kept his hand silent. stable on Max's harness. But his thoughts were racing within as he remembered Max Moss. Was it possible that Max had picked up something from previous alerts, each of which resulted in a discovery or the saving of lives? Regarding the man in the gray suit, the judge spoke to Jack once more. "Mr. Sullivan, your request for Max to be there was extremely unusual, but I permitted it out of consideration for your service. Do you think his response is pertinent to your defense?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jack stated with assurance that Max possesses a remarkable capacity for perception. "I'm not sure what he's feeling, but I think it's crucial that the court took into account what others would overlook." She turned to the prosecutor and said, "Mr. Langston, do you oppose to?" Langston, clearly agitated, waved his hand dismissively while this topic was being investigated further to see whether it would satisfy the court. The judge nodded. "But I fail to understand how the dog's behavior links to the charges against Mr. Sullivan." "Excellent, Mr. Sullivan. I'll let you describe Max's response, but I caution you that it must be specifically related to the case." Jack raised his head slightly and spoke to Max, nodding and thanking him for the privilege. Max sat down in a gentle, authoritative voice, and the dog instantly complied by keeping his body motionless. Aware but now sitting next to Jack's fingertips touched Max's neck fur. Grounding himself while speaking, Max has a knack for seeing things that others missed. I'd observed that Jack started on multiple occasions and has worn me to hide. During interrogations, he can detect tension, anxiety, and guilt. He can also conceal weapons, drugs, and even tell lies. Cannot explain how the judge pushed forward a little, since that's simply how he is. "You think he's sensing anything now that his attention has peaked?" "And sure," Jack stated firmly, "and I think it's coming from." He gestured toward the man wearing the gray suit, and the man's face went white as the entire courtroom turned its focus to him. "And Your Honor," Jack went on, "I asked that this man be identified, and inquired as to if Max is responding to him for a reason which could be detrimental to my defense." The judge paused, obviously considering the strange. As the courtroom waited for her ruling, everyone held their breath until the judge eventually spoke. The bailiff went up to the man who appeared and asked that he be escorted to the witness stand in the gray suit. As he was escorted to the stand, feeling more anxious, Max's gaze remained fixed on, body coiled like a spring, and the man hesitated before stating his name for the record, as directed by the court. Michael Reyes remarked in a scarcely audible voice. "Mr. Rees," the judge said, "you are now under oath, and I advise you to answer honestly," she said firmly. "Do you have any link to this case or the—" As he held onto the side of the stand, defendant Reyes's hands trembled. Jack was here to watch him stammer, but his gut told him that Max's reaction wasn't random, and Jack was committed to finding the truth. The courtroom was electrified, with all eyes on Michael Reyes, who now, sitting uncomfortably in the witness box, his knuckles whitened as he held the edge Max's sharp eyes stayed focused on. His previous low growl has been replaced by an eerie quiet. The tension was released by the judge's voice. "Mr. Reyes, you mentioned that you are here as an observer, but Mr. Sullivan's service dog has reacted strangely to you. The court determines that additional investigation is required due to Mr. Sullivan's background and Max's expertise, so I suggest you to be." Michael swallowed hard when you were direct in your comments. "I'm not sure what." Jack's calm but sharp voice ripped through Max as he muttered, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. "Mr. Reyes, I would like to know why you are here today and whether you have any connection to the prosecutors." Reyes hesitated, his gaze flitting to the prosecutor Langston, who was now in the office, the cops, or something else. Your Honor. Langston shifted uneasily in his chair, sharply interrupting his tone. "This is an unnecessary diversion. We are permitting a dog's behavior to control court processes, so Mr. Reyes's presence here has no influence on this case." Which is absurd, but the judge silenced him by raising her hand. "Mr. Langston, you said that dealing with this behavior would allay the court's worries. So, we are doing so immediately. Kindly don't interrupt," Jack said, leaning forward a little and staring at Reyes with blind eyes. "You're not just are you the observer?" Reyes's shoulders drooped as his respiration accelerated. He revealed in a low voice that he worked for a private detective company, and the courtroom broke into The judge whispered and enveloped her gown once more, saying, "Mr. Orrs, please elaborate on what's your—" "I was recruited to gather information about Mr. Sullivan Reyes, who revealed his voice. So what is your involvement, and why are you here today?" Mr. Langston trembled and jumped up, saying, "Your Honor, I object." The judge's piercing gaze interrupted him as he made an unsubstantiated and irrelevant accusation. Down Mr. Langston, Mr. Reyes, and Reyes' side, which is clearly deflating, I was assigned to, finding anything that might cast doubt on Mr. Sullivan. My directives were clear: ensure that the case was airtight, and Jack experienced a chilly knot in his stomach. "What did you uncover, Mr. Reyes?" Reyes paused. "Pale nothing, or at least nothing that could be used against me, which is why I'm here today." The judge's expression intensified, and I was instructed to watch in case something helpful came up during the trial. "Is this accurate, Langston? Did you employ a private investigator to obtain unrelated information about Mr. Sullivan?" Langston's cheeks reddened. "Your Honorable, this is standard procedure to guarantee a comprehensive case. There is nothing immoral about employing investigators, unless the judge intervened with the intention of influencing the trial's verdict." Her voice was cold, and Mr. Langston, this court does not support such behavior. Think of this as a caution. Jack's thoughts was racing when Rees made the important revelation. Max addressed Rees once more, but it didn't explain his reaction. "Why did Max select you out? Is there something you're not?" Reyes paused before informing us, and perspiration formed on his forehead. "I promise, Max, I have no idea." Shifted next to Jack, his ears perking forward as though he was paying close attention, and Jack's hold on the leash tightened. "Max isn't." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Reyes, the court, and I am not persuaded, requires complete openness. If you omit any pertinent information, you risk being charged with perjury and obstruction of justice." Rees's shoulders drooped even more, and during my investigation, he grudgingly said one thing. "A stranger contacted me and offered to pay me to make up evidence against Mr. Sullivan, but I turned him down. But he was persistently hostile," and the judge's face worsened. "I don't know this man's true name, but he went by Dixon." Reyes shook his head. The revelation sent another ripple through the courtroom, claiming to have links that may make or break cases. Dixon mumbled as Jack's jaw tightened, recalling a name that had been spoken during a previous case involving Dixon. "Mr. Reyes, you will be held in detention until the judge addresses the court officers about police corruption." Reyes nodded humbly in relief, adding that this court must guarantee your protection and confirm your claims. As the bailiff removed Reyes from the stand, Max, his expression was filled with terror. Jack crouched next to him and ran his hand over Max's fur as he eventually softened his body language. "Good boy," he muttered. But as the courtroom calmed down, Jack realized that this was just the start, because Dixon's name had caused a gateway that opened in a hazardous area. It was obvious that someone was wanted. They were prepared to go to great lengths to quiet Jack, and the courtroom was filled with a combination of. As Reyes was being brought away, the judge called for a quick break to calm the tension and anxiety. Jack sat quietly with his hand on Max's back as she went over the consequences of the testimony. However, Dixon's name was still very much in his mind, echoing like a siren. Jack had discovered that name was connected to a sinister character and spoken in the gloomy corners of precincts years ago while he was on the force, who manipulated witnesses, evidence, and even entire cases while working in the gray areas of law enforcement. Dixon. As the court reconvened, Jack shifted his position and his sightless eyes turned toward a ghost that was known but never captured. The judge's authority was conveyed by the sound of the gavel. "This court will not put up with meddling in the legal system. We shall investigate the allegations made against the trial's integrity." By Prosecutor Langston appeared clearly upset, but he managed to gather himself sufficiently to tell the court, "Your Honor, that I agreed with Mr. Reyes. Acts. I have never met or spoken with this Dixon person. Thus there is no proof linking me to him directly." Sandra Mills, Jack's lawyer, defended Your Honor, while Mr. Langston denied engagement with Dixon. "We need to think about whether there is a bigger conspiracy going on given my client's past with." The judge nodded, saying that he is a target because he exposed corruption. "Does your—" Jack leaned into the microphone, his voice calm but carrying and the client had any idea who this Dixon might be. With a trace of annoyance, "Your Honor, Dixon is a fixer, not just any man. Involved because someone in a position of authority wanted this case to be compromised." The judge scowled. "Do you have any proof to?" Mr. Sullivan, Jack reluctant to provide any hard proof for this assertion. But Max is. "Max and I have experience enough to trust his instincts, especially when it comes to Reyes." So his response wasn't random. "Danger." The judge nodded calmly in agreement, understanding that this court takes these issues seriously. "We'll move carefully," but all of a sudden the doors to the courtroom opened, and a court officer came up to the bench. He quickly handed the judge a piece of pap paper, and as she read it, her face clouded. "It seems like we might have a..." Dixon cops took the lead on this, tracking out Reyes's last known communications, and gasps echoed across the judge's room as one number matched an ongoing inquiry into organized corruption. Spoke to the court. "This matter has now grown beyond its initial parameters, and we need to make sure that everyone involved is protected. While law enforcement does additional investigation, I'm temporarily adjourning this court. Mr. Sullivan, you are suggested to continue wearing a protective watch." Jack scowled. "But what about?" The judge's tone softened. "Max and I have experienced worse without guards. This is not a request, Mr. Sullivan. It's a..." Jack was both frustrated and uncomfortable about being confined to the room as the gavel struck, signifying the adjournment. He liked to confront problems head-on rather than provide protection, but he also understood that this was no typical situation. Therefore, Jack sat in. Max laid at his feet, occasionally listening to the faint background of the city's silent hum in his small apartment. Miss Jack was twitching like though she was aware of something, and she couldn't get rid of the impression that things were getting out of hand. A harsh knock on the door stopped Max's thoughts, and he instantly jumped to attention, snarling low as Jack moved. With caution, his hand naturally rested on the collar that held Max's ID and tracker. "Who is it, detective?" Jack relaxed a little when Ruiz responded, because he was one of the few officers he trusted to open the door. Whispered, "We've got a problem, Jack," lowering her voice as she met the detective who had moved in front of her. "Dixon's lead is more significant than we initially believed. He is connected to several instances of judicial manipulation in Reyes's testimony." "You're not safe here, Jack," she said, "putting a target on your back." "When will I ever be safe?" Ruiz smiled slightly, but swiftly became serious. "This isn't a joke, and we decipher a message indicating Dixon is already taking steps to conceal his." Max hissed softly as though he agreed with Jack. "Trap Max, and you're on the list. I'm not running if Dixon wants to quiet me." So I crouched next to him and stroked his head. Ruiz scowled. "Jack, you're blind. You can't do what?" "You'll have to face me." Jack cut him off, saying, "I've survived war, betrayal, and corruption." Ruiz paused. "But Max and I need intelligence to fight, not sight." Then gave it a file that would help with names, locations, and everything we have on it. "You didn't get this from me, though." Jack from Dixon's network accepted the file and ran his fingertips over the Braille translations she had carefully added. "Thank you so much, Ruiz." She nodded. "Just tell me you'll be careful," Jack smirked. "Be careful, that's not my style," and walked away, leaving Jack to sit quietly and take it all in. A whispered reminder that he wasn't alone, Max pushed his hand under the weight of what lied ahead. The room was poorly lighted, and the odds were improbable that this time would be no different. Jack sat at his little kitchen table, which Ruiz had given him the file detective file, lit only by a desk lamp. His fingers skillfully navigated the Braille pages that were splayed out in front of him, taking up. Max laid at his feet as he studied every detail of Dixon's network, and the pieces started to fit together. Jack felt his head resting on his boots, but his ears were tingling at every slight noise coming from the corridor outside. Max's partner's stress was a reflection of his own tense feelings. Jack leaned back in his chair and exhaled softly, seemed prepared for anything. Max raised his head and said, "They can frighten us." His voice was low, eyes meeting Jack's blind ones. "But they are unsure of who they are interacting with, because the file disclosed Dixon's relationships to numerous high-profile corruption cases that include government enforcement, as well as private investigators like Rees. Enforce for cops, attorneys, and even politicians." Jack's stomach turned over when he saw how this network of power extended well beyond him. It was a structure created to shield lawbreakers and Jack froze his hand when he heard a strong knock at the door, interrupting anyone who was interfering with his thoughts. He moved immediately to Max's collar and muttered in a warning tone. Max rose instantly, his body tensed as he placed himself between Jack and the door, asking, "Who is Jack calling?" Ruiz responded in a calm voice, but Jack hesitated because of the tone, which wasn't quite correct either. Jack was too hurried and worried to move Ruiz. He asked his voice what the secret word was. Sharp Ruiz had demanded the creation of a code word sooner, aware of the dangers of. A muffled curse came from Jack's heart after there was silence on the other side of the door from someone posing as her. Thumped as he seized Max's leash, saying, "Time to move," he muttered as he made his way to the apartment's rear fire escape. Max trailed behind him, silent but determined, and when they arrived at the window, Jack heard a latch. Jack eased the window open in the chilly night, knowing that whoever was on the other side of that door was being picked. Max leaped through, first landing on the metal grate, the air cutting across his flesh. Even though he couldn't see, Jack followed his movements with accustomed ease, being quick and accurate as he closed the. Jack heard heavy footsteps entering the flat through the window behind him, and the sound of drawers being opened, wrenched open, causing furniture to topple over, and whomever was searching for something or someone, Jack. Jack paused when they arrived at the alley below. Max followed them down the fire escape, their footfalls soft on the metal. He listened carefully to the sounds of the city all around him, including the distant hum of traffic and the occasional dog bark. He could hear the muffled sounds of the intruders fighting among themselves, but there was also the faint buzz of pedestrians. "They're gone," one of them snarled, and they couldn't have gone very far. Jack's jaw tightened, his thoughts racing. Had to reach Ruiz or another reliable person, but remaining in one spot was too risky, so he signaled Max, and the intruders may have parked on a side street off the main road, which the dog guided him toward. Jack's mind shifted to Ruiz as he passed into the shadows, wondering if she had been compromised or if she was being captured by Dixon's troops. The thought chilled him to the bone. Ruiz was one of his last remaining allies, and he couldn't. Max abruptly halted, his body rigid, unable to afford to lose her, and Jack huddled next to him. "What is it, boy?" he asked, placing his hand on the dog's shoulder. Max's low growl was. The invader ERS had split apart, and Jack strained his ears to hear the faint sound of approaching footfall, and one was moving toward them. Jack sensed the icy steel of his service pistol nestled inside the. He hadn't used the holster under his jacket in years, not since the tragedy that had caused him to lose his sight, but he was. Jack heard the footfall get louder and then halt, and he was ready to protect himself and Max if it came to that. The man said, "Hey," and there was no evidence of the intruder, who was probably muttering into a radio. Jack grinned, feeling a wave of sour satisfaction flood over him. Blind, how far could he have gotten? People always undervalued him due to his blindness, which he had learned to take advantage of when the intruder moved. They needed a strategy to turn the tables on Dixon, so Jack and Mom moved farther into the alley while staying in the shadows. In his network, before things become even more unmanageable a few hours later, Jack and Max sought safety in a modest, former safe house that Jack had utilized when working as an undercover agent. Unremarkable, hidden in a forgotten area of the city, Jack leaned against the door and locked it behind him. Max sat next to him, his tail waving slightly as Jack knelt down to rest, his chest heaving as he gathered his breath. Pressing his forehead to Max's good kid, he whispered, "We'll work this out together." Jack sat at the small desk in the safe house with the Dixon file spread out in front of him as dawn broke. He was aware of this fight was still ongoing, but with Max at his side and the facts beginning to come to light, he had a glimmer of optimism that this was about exposing the wrongdoing that had taken place, not just about him anymore. Early morning light crept through the dusty shutters of the safe, a system he had previously promised to protect. The aged wooden floor Jack sitting at the tiny desk had faint patterns cast by the house. Max was snuggled up close to the door, his fingertips tracing the braille file that Detective Ruiz had given him, alert and his body ready to respond to any noise Jack thinks of. Dixon's criminal network was more than just intimidation, and he was buzzing with the significance of what he had discovered thus far. And bribes. It also included smuggling of weapons, human trafficking, and a series of unsolved murders that had being written off as gang-related. The extent was astounding, and the more Jack investigated, the more obvious it seemed that this Dixon wasn't working alone. He was a part of something far bigger. Jack was startled by a sharp pounding at the door. Max leaped to his feet and positioned himself between Jack and the entryway, keeping Jack safe until he got to his weapon. Sensations heightened. He shouted out, and his firm yet steady voice announced that Ruiz had arrived. Jack hesitated when she responded in a low, urgent voice, the earlier break-in still fresh in his mind. "What's the—" Jack relaxed a little as she whispered the code word he demanded. "Valor." Ruiz unlocked the door, opened it carefully, and motioned for Max to get down. Entered, her face strained and pale, and she swiftly shut the door after looking around the room as if Jack questioned in a stronger tone than he meant, expecting someone to follow along. Ruiz let out a shaky exhale. She pulled a chair to the desk and added, "They know I gave you the file." I had just about left Dixon's station. With ears everywhere, Jack clenched his jaw, his cool exterior belying boiling wrath. What should he do now? You have a strategy, or are we just going around in circles? Ruiz paused, then reached inside her bag and took out a second. The higher-ups are the ones who said, "This isn't just about Dixon anymore," in a voice that was just audible above a whisper. "Supporting him, they're connected to an offshore account that serves as a slush money for extortion, bribery, and worse, Jacks. How can we reveal them without being killed?" Fingers traced the braille on the new file's cover. Ruiz acknowledged, "That's where we'll need help. I've contacted someone who has been monitoring this network for years. Lisa Marks, an investigative journalist, is meeting us and taking a significant risk, but she believes in taking." Later that evening, Jack and Ruiz met Lisa Marks in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The journalist was younger than Jack had anticipated, with short dark hair framing her keen features. Held a leather satchel with photos, USB drives, and notes. Lisa Dixon didn't waste any time going into the specifics, saying that she is a little time in comparison to those in charge, arranging a number of pictures on the table, showing some of the important figures, including politicians, corporate executives, and even a Jack ran his fingertips over the federal judges system, which they have constructed to protect themselves at any costs. Dixon and Lisa nodded. "I've been working on this. The photos show his unpleasant look, and you're certain we can connect them to him. I've had whistleblower testimony, tapes, and papers for years, but I've been waiting for the ideal time to reveal everything. If we reveal Dixon first, it will lead to his arrest. May make the superiors panic, and that's when we hit Jack." His mind was racing as he took in the information. He asked Lisa, "What's our next move?" As this was more than he had expected, and the risks were monumental. They exchanged "We must acquire Dixon's confession, and if he implicates those in positions of authority, we will have enough to handle this." Look with Ruiz. Jack, Ruiz, and Lisa spent the next few hours coming up with a strategy for the FBI. The objective was straightforward in theory, but risky in practice: forcing Dixon into a predicament. Ruiz recommended employing an old informant from a precinct, a man named Carlos, where he would feel trapped enough to speak, had a past relationship with Dixon, and might be prepared to assist in return for immunity. Thus the team decided to hold the meeting at a remote area, with Ruiz and Carlos giving assistance while Jack and Max challenged Dixon. Lisa would remain close behind, prepared to record the exchange and make sure they had reliable proof, as the Jack couldn't get rid of the feeling that they were playing a risky game as the plan came to fruition. Dixon wasn't just a criminals like that didn't go down without a fight, and with the plan in place, he was a desperate guy backed into a corner. Jack and Max walked back to the location where Jack and Ruiz had parted ways, with Lisa agreeing to meet again the next night. Jack's mind shifted to the dangers that lay ahead in the safe house, knowing that the stakes were high for everyone, not just himself. Max touched Jack's calf, noticing his discomfort, and Jack reached down to ruffle. He said, "We can get through this boy with the dog's fur," as a small gesture of comfort. Jack's phone buzzed as they got closer to the safe place, and it was a text change of plans from Ruiz. "Meet me at the docks at midnight. And don't worry, nobody's Jack's." As he read the letter, his heart fell. The game was turning more quickly than he had expected, and he was forced to. At nightfall, the docks were a world of whispers and shadows, and the faint smell of salt water blended with the. Jack, with Max sat at his side, stood rigidly at the edge of the pier, surrounded by the metallic tang of Ed's cargo containers. With his ears perking up at every creak and creak of the ancient wooden planks underneath, Jack's thoughts were racing with queries why the plans were abruptly changed, what Ruiz had learned that called for such hurry, and whether he could trust her. Utterly, because the stakes were now too high for errors or misdirected faith. As a black sedan drew closer to Jack, the set of headlights cut through the night, and the sound of an engine grew louder. When the car halted, Detective stiffened his hand, which was softly resting on Max's harness. Under the light of a single dockside bulb, Ruiz emerged with a pale and drawn face. Looking over the empty docks here, she called softly, "Jack." Max moved in perfect unison with him as he approached warily. "What's going on, Ruiz?" "This better not be a trap," said. "It's worse than we thought. Dixon's men are onto the U.S. They've put a price on your head." She shook her head gravely. "And mine," Jack was shivering. "How did they discover that I don't?" "Although the journalist Lisa is also under risk, they attempted to." Jack clenched his fists in rage after ambushing her an hour ago. She barely made it out alive and is now hiding. Increasing. "So what should we do? Run or fight back?" Ruiz paused. When her car's trunk was unlocked, a duffel bag containing weapons, burner phones, and the words, "If we don't act immediately, Dixon's going to elude our grasp. He intends to depart the nation tomorrow morning." Jack's forehead is creased. "What's your?" Ruiz stated that we know where he's meeting his colleagues tonight, a warehouse on the south side, if we force his hand. Although it's risky and we'll be outnumbered, we can corner him there and force him to go to Toka, exposing the entire network. Jack's thoughts were racing. Breaking into a warehouse occupied by armed guys was a gamble, but it was unthinkable to let Dixon get away. His determination became stronger as he gazed down at Max, who was observing Ruiz. Jack remarked, "At last, you're asking me to enter a death trap, but if it means stopping Dixon, I'm and Max and I will protect you while they get ready for the procedure." Jack felt the pressure of his choice mounting on him. Ruiz gave him a revolver and a little earphone. Her face was a mixture of shame and resolve. "I realize this is a lot to ask, but..." Jack nodded in a low voice and continued, "We don't have anyone else to trust. Ruiz, this isn't about you or me. It's about justice and ensuring that no." For a brief moment, the two came to a profound understanding that one another suffers due of individuals like Dixon, putting their reputations, professions, and everything else on the line for a cause that might not even succeed as they pushed toward the. Jack was informed by Warehouse Ruiz on the strategy and layout, and she stated that Max's training may provide. Jack replied softly, "He's more than just a dog," reaching down to touch Max behind the ears. "We need Jack for the edge week. When I am unable to see, he is my partner, and he has never failed me." Rui grinned. "Faintly good, because we'll need all the assistance we can get the warehouse's corrugated metal walls in order tonight." Jack and Ruiz parked their vehicle a safe distance away and came closer, their faces reflecting the dim glow of the distant city lights. Max was leading the way on foot, keeping his nose down, and they stopped at the edge of a shipping container yard. Ruiz muttered, pointing to a line of SUVs parked outside the warehouse gate. "Dixon's in there. We need." Jack's jaw tensed as Ruiz walked cautiously toward the warehouse to get him alone. The tension in the air was high as Jack and Max positioned themselves outside aside and signaled for them to follow. Upon entering, the sound of voices and the sporadic clang of metal reverberated. Jack listened carefully through the empty room, his other senses growing more acute because he couldn't see. Could hear Dixon's clear voice giving instructions to his soldiers. He was too self-assured for anyone. Ruiz nodded at Jack as she prepared to be cornered, her hand on the door handle. With his heart racing, Jack clutched Max's harness as she mouthed, "Let's do this." The door creaked open just enough for Jack, Max, and Ruiz to enter the barely illuminated Shadows warehouse. Oil, rust, and cigarette smoke filled the air as it danced across the walls from the swinging overhead lights. There was a noticeable tension, interrupted by the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Then Dixon's voice broke through his men's whisper. "This shipment must vanish by dawn. No errors or you'll. I regret it. His icy, dominating tone served as a clear reminder of his immense authority. Jack hunkered down, depending on Max's nuanced gestures to direct him toward the dogs. Every step was quiet, every pause purposeful, and the training shone through Ruiz. Followed closely behind her, keeping an eye out for danger as they approached the location of the voices Jack could hear. Dixon was standing next to a stack of boxes with at least 4 different persons, their silhouettes visible between slats. Ruiz leaned toward Jack, her whisper barely audible over the table laden with documents and his security on either side. Jack nodded. If we just barge in, it will be his word against ours. So we need him to incriminate himself. And if we can, let's give him enough rope to hang himself, Ruiz said, pointing to a line of barrels stacked to their left. Approach that area so I can record his talk. You remain here with Max. Jack paused because he detested the thought of Ruiz endangering herself, but he wanted to be prepared in case things went wrong. Recognized the need to exercise caution, he remarked in a forceful yet quiet voice, and Ruiz gave a tight nod and moved as smoothly into the shadows as a predator pursuing its victim. Jack remained behind with his hand on Max's harness. The dog stayed vigilant, turning his ears to listen for every noise as Ruiz entered. Dixon's voice changed. We have a leak, his voice brimming with. Jack tightened his hold after I had police sniffing around after one of you fools slipped. Ruiz hesitated and pressed herself against the edge of a container as Max tightened. She had her phone in her hand, and while she recorded every word, Dixon, the screen faded. Further, they'll wish they hadn't been born if I find out who's to blame. Until then, we adhere to the regardless. The package is scheduled to depart tonight. However, one of the bodyguards had an objection. What about the journalist? Dixon chuckled icily. Not for long. I've got someone taking care of you. Ruiz's eyes widened at the revelation as we spoke, and she turned to look at Jack. Her attitude was frantic, and even though Jack couldn't see her, he could tell that something had changed because Max let out. Jack becomes uneasy when he hears a low growl that is nearly undetectable. What is it, boy? Before Ruiz could share what she had heard, he murmured. The situation abruptly changed, and one of Dixon's men became twitchy that a man with pointed features began to approach the location where Ruiz was hiding. Did you hear that? Ruiz froze, pressing her body against the holster he was holding at his hip. She kept her breath against the container, determined to stay hidden. Jack's heartbeat increased. He could feel Max moved as every muscle in his body tensed up like a spring in anticipation of danger. Ruiz crouched as the man turned the corner, his flashlight scanning over the containers, his body stiff and ready. The beam almost missed her as she was moving, but as she did, her foot brushed over a loose piece of metal, launching. It clatters to the ground, and the man who barked and pulled out his weapon as Ruiz ran to make a bina for Jack and Max, while the man yelled to warn the rest. Dixon narrowed his eyes and snarled, "Find them. Don't let them go," as he took a revolver from the table. Dixon's crew spread the quiet tension in this warehouse until it broke into chaos. Jack realized they could no longer rely on concealment as their spotlights broke through the darkness. Max, go Jack. Max's muscular frame darted into action as soon as he was told to release the dog. Max growled and knocked the man to the ground as he approached the closest assailant, barely giving him time to respond. Ruiz's hasty footsteps reverberated throughout the warehouse, and Jack followed them, his cane tapping quietly as he made his way through the disorderly scene. Ruiz, where are you? She yelled, her voice piercing the commotion. She took hold of Jack's arm and led him to a pile of metal barrels. We need backup. Jack, since we're outnumbered, tightened his jaw. If Dixon escapes, there is no time to wait. The turmoil will prove that the entire effort was in vain. Dixon made his move, sneaking via a side door with his remaining bodyguards on either side. Ruiz noticed him, and Jack jerked his head toward the sound of the door slamming shut. Max uttered a curse under her breath, and he summoned Jack remarked, "We're going after him," as the dog instantly reacted and ran back to his side. His tone was brooking. No argument. Ruiz paused, then nodded, putting an end to this before Max and Jack. Ruiz ran toward The warehouse burst in chaos as Dixon's surviving men entered through the side door he had used for his escape ESC. Shouts and torches bounced around the vast room as they frantically tried to keep control, but Jack and Ruiz remained concentrated on their aim. And as they broke through the door, the three of them were in an alleyway drenched in the air was filled with the eerie glare of a flickering street light, the scent of gasoline and wet asphalt, and the distant hum of the metropolis served as a stressful background, and Jack held Max's leash tightly in both directions. Ruiz looked around, her keen eyes catching a glimpse of the taillights going out, and he questioned in an agitated tone. She pulled Jack's arm as he turned a corner and said, "He's getting into a car, Max. Let out a low bark already." Jack trusted his partner entirely to lead the way as they strained to follow the scent of their quarry, who was Max the dog, rushed ahead, dragging Jack with his strong steps as Ruiz ran by their side. The gang just turned the corner. They arrived at Main Street just in time to spot Dixon's svelte black SUV speeding down the street. Jack and Ruiz turned to see Officer Daniels' familiar voice calling out behind them, "You two need a ride." After hearing the disturbance on the radio, the cruiser parked haphazardly at the curb and immediately came to Ruiz's aid. "Yes, Dixon is attempting to flee." Daniel yelled, "Get in," and threw open the car. Ruiz went into the front seat, and Jack and Max climbed into the rear. Dixon's SUV swerved across traffic as Daniels pressed the gas, the tires squealing as the cruiser rushed forward. Daniels skillfully navigated the streets while the driver made reckless turns in an effort to lose them, grasped the dashboard and fixed her gaze on the car in front of her, saying, "He's going toward the industrial district." Jack leaned forward, his palm resting on Max's back, his words smooth despite the adrenaline pulsing through her veins. Daniels sadly agreed. "We can't let him disappear into those warehouses because he'll disappear for good. Hold on, things are going to get tough." He cut through an intersection just as the light turned, swerving violently. Max growled slightly as the cruiser remained on Dixon's tail despite the red horns blaring. As they drew closer to the industrial area, Dixon's driver's keen senses of the growing tension made. The SUV swerved onto a narrow side street in a desperate maneuver, its tires sliding. Daniels followed the cruiser's sirens as they wailed through the night on the damp tarmac. The pursuit led them farther into a maze of shuttered factories and loading docks. The silence was uncanny. Dixon's SUV abruptly stopped in the dark, ominous shadows, and the doors opened. The door. Dixon and his bodyguard fled, hiding behind a line of corroded crates. Daniels killed the engine and turned to face Ruiz. "This is troublesome. Are you armed?" Ruiz said, nodding. Jack tightened his hold on Max's strap and took a little revolver out of her holster. Daniels hesitated and then consented. "But be careful. We have this Max that can flush them out." With their pistols drawn, Ruiz and Daniels hid behind a pile of crates. Jack squatted down, his hand grazing. The dog was quivering with intensity against Max's fur, ready to act. Jack uttered a low, "Dixon, Max," the command finder, walked like a shadow, his training visible in his keen sense of smell led him directly to one of Dixon's bodyguards as he dashed between the containers. Saw him, yelled, and raised his firearm before Max could shoot. Ruiz grabbed the chance by locking his strong jaws onto the man's arm and stepping out from hiding to disarm the bodyguard. The man crushed his weapon and sent it clattering on his shoulder. Dixon's voice was wild as he yelled commands from the ground, falling back and making his way to the docks. Jack cautiously advanced after following Max's instructions and could hear Dixon in a frenzy. "Dixon, Jack called as you were running out of places to hide, and you heard footsteps fleeing over gravel." Dixon made a final move as Ruiz and Daniels attempted to cut off his escape. "You don't understand. Ditch tried to negotiate," he yelled, his voice resonating. Ruiz scoffed at you, saying, "This isn't just about me. If I go down, I'm taking a lot of people with me." Dixon chuckled sourly. "You're chasing me, but you don't even realize that you're going down. Know that half of the file I deleted had a list of all the politicians involved, not just proof. CEOs, whom you would never suspect." Paused as Ruiz's grip tightened. Jack furrowed his brow at her weapon, noticing the change in the air. "Don't let him distract you," Jack murmured, stalling, but Ruiz couldn't get Dixon's remarks off his mind if he was. The room crackled with tension as they revealed the truth. Their goal had just gotten considerably more complicated. Dixon's remarks lingered in the atmosphere, causing uncertainty and anxiety in Ruiz's thoughts. Reyes considered the ramifications of his remarks, wondering if a network of influential people actually existed, protecting him, and if so, how far would they go to keep their secrets safe as Daniels and Ruiz dealt with the seriousness. Max had not wavered in the face of Dixon's revelation. His keen nose followed Dixon's scent, guiding Jack through the maze of. Jack depended on the faint pulls of Max's harness, his senses sharpened by years, to navigate containers and corroded machinery. As they turned a curve and Jack muttered, "Of training with the dog, Max, steady." They were near, as indicated by the slight crunching of gravel beneath foot, and Jack could sense Dixon's despair in the. Dixon stopped suddenly as a predator cornered him and prepared to strike out ahead. When he realized he had no obvious way out, he aimed a gun and twisted his face in a mix of dread and wrath. Dixon trembled and barked, "Stay back," saying, "I'll shoot." Jack's hand automatically tightened on Max's strap. "But don't think I won't. Dixon, you have no other choice." Dixon chuckled cruelly, but he replied, "Put down the weapon. This doesn't have to end badly. You're more naive than I am if you believe that defeating me would resolve the issue. You've won, but you have no idea what you're up against." Before Jack could reply, Ruiz appeared out of the shadows, her weapon aimed at Dixon. She dropped it. Dixon's gaze raced between Jack and Ruiz, figuring out his next move. "But we've got you surrounded." He scoffed and said, "You take me in, and they'll bury this whole thing. It's better to take that chance than to let Ruiz retort you. So drop the gun. You'll be lucky if you keep your jobs." Max snarled low as Dixon paused, his finger lingering over the trigger. Jack was tense and about to attack, but he could sense Max's intensity and knew the dog was awaiting the order. Dixon's hand faltered as the confrontation dragged on for excruciating seconds. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice shaking as his willpower crumbled under the strain of the circumstance. "I'm not the." Ruiz didn't flinch. "But if you remove me, you'll be opening a Pandora's box. We'll handle it when the. You're the issue in front of me right now. D. Dixon, this is your last chance." Dixon dropped the rifle, and his shoulders slumped as his confidence finally gave way to defeat. Ruiz rushed in quickly, kicking the gun away as he lowered it gently and let it fall to the ground. Although her tone was without pity, she stated, "You've made the correct decision by putting him in handcuffs, but don't." As Ruiz and Daniels led Dixon back toward the waiting squad, "Briefly imagine that you're leaving this clean." He grinned and said, "You think this is over? It's just getting started, people I work with. Because you'll regret leaving me in that warehouse when they come for you." Ruiz tightened her hold on. Dixon's arm let them in. "We'll be prepared." Jack stayed silent, his thoughts racing. Dixon's cryptic warnings and queries suggested a bigger plot that would have far-reaching effects for. Max remained by Jack's side, providing stability even after they had captured their target. Jack knelt. He ran his hand over Max's head and said, "Good job, buddy." The dog nuzzled him and waggled his tail. Despite the commotion, Max had quietly carried out his training to safeguard and help. Ruiz looked at Jack and added, "We couldn't have done this without Max." Jack gave a small smile. "Beyond that, he's my partner." When the squad got Dixon into a police car, Ruiz's phone rang with a. "We've retrieved the damaged documents from the warehouse," according to a communication from the forensic team that read multiple pages appear to be recoverable. And when Ruiz gave Jack the letter, her expression said that grim Dixon wasn't. Jack nodded, his jaw set, and we played to the lie that there was a bigger game at play here. The squad car's flashing lights created long shadows as they drove away from the warehouse district. Dixon, with his tied hands in his lap and an eerie smirk, sat in the back of one of the abandoned buildings. Ruiz's expression, which was playing on his lips, was that of a man who liked to keep secrets from other people. Traveled in the car before him, her thoughts racing about the evidence that had been found and Dixon's mysterious warnings. She looked at her phone and read the message from the forensic team regarding the identities that were discovered in the documents again. If Dixon is speaking the truth, each name could be a component of a much bigger puzzle, she whispered. She sat silently, knowing that this could blow everything up in another carjack. The repetitive sounds of some of the tires on the road, with Max by his side, stood in sharp contrast to the mayhem driven by adrenaline of the chase. Putting his palm on Max's harness and finding solace in the dog's constant presence as Jack's mind wandered. Jack murmured softly, scratching. "We've taken Dixon down for his taunts about the corrupt system protecting him." Max replied with a low, comforting glass of wine. "But what if that's only the beginning? How far does this go?" The convoy was halfway to the police station when the lead car's radio went off, indicating that we would tackle it collectively. There was a roadblock ahead with an urgent alert, and there were unmarked vehicles reported in the area. "Move carefully." Ruiz's stomach constricted. "This isn't right," she whispered. Before the police could react, the driver that had ordered the blockade screamed into view, cutting off the convoy was trapped as two other cars blocked them from behind at the same time. Men in tactical gear poured out of vans along a limited section of road, their faces hidden by masks as they walked. Ruiz said, "It's an ambush," and pulled out military precision weaponry, attracting her. Officers rushed to establish a protective circle around the cars in order to protect Dixon, who was their target. However, the assailants were well coordinated and shooting from heavily armed. Jack knelt down, his fingers firmly on Max's harness, as harsh cracks reverberated throughout the cramped area. "Stay down, boy," murmured. "We're not done yet." Assumed command, and while firing back at the police, she moved with deliberate. Her thoughts was laser-focused on the single goal of keeping Dixon alive if these men were present to silence him, because, in the heat of the chaos, they had not understood how crucial his information was. He ordered the dog to be released since he understood they needed an advantage, and Max ran into action, his keen intuition piercing the chaos as he maneuvered between vehicles and assailants. His deep growl, One of the attackers saw Max and aimed his rifle at him, warning anybody in his way. But the dog was too fast with Max made a strong leap and grabbed the man's arm, causing him to drop the gun. Ruiz was able to neutralize the attacker with a well-placed shot in the middle of the chaos. Firefighter Dixon spotted a chance when the officers were preoccupied, so he slipped out of the rear seat and started to run. Ruiz's desperation pushed him forward, despite the fact that his hands were still in handcuffs, toward the woods bordering the road. Saw him and muttered a curse as Dixon fled, calling out, "Jack, can you get on it, Jack?" Max was already moving when he was interrupted, and he rushed off like a missile. Jack's training began as he followed Dixon's scent through the brush, guided by Max's moves. And Dixon staggered into the thick jungle, his breathing labored, as he heard trees shattering beneath him. Fell hard to the ground after tripping over a fallen log, and before he could help himself, Max showed up standing over him with Dixon froze in terror, his eyes wide, and he let out a low, deadly growl. I'll tell you everything," Jack yelled, his voice shaking. A second later, his form silhouetted. He had his cane in one hand and Max's back in the other, against the moonlight coming through the woods. Jack spoke in a firm voice. "This is your chance to cooperate. Now it's on our terms." Dixon's bravery broke down. "Okay, just get this dog away from me," Jack said, as Max took a little step back. Dixon Ruiz arrived soon after she had drawn her gun, her cautious gaze never leaving it. She said, "Don't move," firmly securing Dixon's ankle for precaution. Once they were back on the road, the ambush had been neutralized. Officers radioed for backup to retrieve the assailants after securing their vans and the cash and weapons they had brought. Fled the location without incident. When Jack and Ruiz came back with Dixon, the vanquished man whispered to himself, "You don't know." Ruiz grinned and said, "You're right, Dixon. What you're dealing with isn't over." Despite the reinforcements, the convoy, which was only getting started, reached the police precinct under strict protection. Officers ringed the area, keeping an eye out for any indication of further threats, as anxiety persisted in the air. Dixon, now completely restrained, he was led inside, his smirk having given way to a somber look. Jack stood next to Ruiz. Despite being quiet, the dog kept his ears open while his hand rested on Max's harness. Alert, as though sensing that the threat wasn't completely gone, Ruiz looked at Jack and said, "We have him, but this isn't the..." Finally, she stated in a determined tone that Dixon's network is as vast as he says, therefore this could just Be the tip of the iceberg, Jack nodded. So we need to play this cleverly. He's now afraid, which indicates that we have. Leverage. Dixon stood across from Ruiz and another officer in the interview room, his cuffed hands lying on. Jack and Max watched from behind the one-way glass of the chilly steel table, the former officer's ears sensitive to every. Ruiz leaned forward and spoke in a calm, crisp voice, allowing Dixon to interrupt the game. We both know that you are not the mastermind, so please assist us in dismantling this. You are facing charges that will bring you to ruin. Dixon scoffed, his eyes darting anxiously. You think you can just do this operation and we might be able to cut you a deal? Take them out. You don't realize how strong they are. They'll come for you and me, Ruiz. Did you not flinch? Dixon, you only have one chance to cooperate if we're not the ones in handcuffs. He paused for a long moment, his shoulders sunk with the weight of his situation, and then he started speaking. Modest and cautious, he identified safe houses, gave names, and discussed specific actions. Ruiz's pen frantically scribbled over a notebook, documenting every detail behind the glass using secret communication techniques. As Jack listened carefully, his thoughts were racing with links from the cases he had worked on, like parts of a puzzle. Max grounded himself in the midst of the information storm by resting his head on Jack's lap during the interrogation. Dixon went on to say in a scarcely audible voice, "There's a list. They maintain their untouchability by having a roster of authorities on their payroll who judge politicians, police officers, and others." Dixon paused once more when Ruiz noticed her eyes narrowing. "Where's the list?" Then mumbled, "It's encrypted on a drive hidden in my apartment, but they'll destroy it before you get to it." Ruiz didn't even hesitate to enter the building. She stood up suddenly and strode out of the room, her jaw dropping. Jack met her in the corridor, and he was certain. "We need that drive," she remarked, but he was correct. Jack rekindled a glimmer of his former resolve before we arrived, so we don't try to extinguish it. Provide them with the opportunity. A team comprising Jack, Ruiz, and a squad of officers. The pressure of the mission pressing down on them every second as they raced toward Dixon's residence. Second, Ruiz informed the crew that we were dealing with experts on the way. Prioritize securing the drive and anticipate opposition if Dixon's assertions are. It's true that this may blow their entire organization apart, but Jack listened and kept his focus despite his blindness. With years of expertise handling high-stakes situations, Max was able to detect his handler's resolve and sat ready and attentive. For action, it was unusually quiet when they got at Dixon's fancy apartment complex. The team trained. Jack and Max remained close behind Ruiz, using their combined instincts to secure the perimeter and clear rooms precisely. They worked well together, and when they arrived at Dixon's flat, the door was ajar. Ruiz gave the warning that there was a definite indication that someone had been there, and the team moved into the area in formation. Max's nose twitched, and he tensed when he saw the papers and furniture scattered all over the floor. Jack sensed the shift and muttered, "He's got something." Max led them to a concealed panel in the wall, where they were desperately clawing. Ruiz opened it, exposing a little safe. "Booyah," she said, removing a laptop, and, before they could rejoice, an external drive occurred. A shadow appeared in the room's corner, and bullets were heard. The squad squatted down for protection. Two armed men had been waiting, intent on keeping the secrets Dixon had promised Jack. His voice was quiet but stern as he whispered, "Keep your harness down, Max." Ordered. Ruiz returned fire with a sharp aim, taking out his stiff and eager body. The second man lunged at her, but Max sprang in front of him. Ruiz had ample time to restrain the man with the attackers after he stumbled and was intercepted with a fierce growl. Ruiz turned to Jack, who neutralized the team and secured the laptop and drive. She remarked, "This could be the break we've been waiting for." Jack, with a smile that broke through her serious manner, nodded, his hand on Max's head. "It's a beginning, but it's not quite over yet." Officers acted swiftly to relieve the tension in the air as the convoy returned safely to the precinct. Ruiz and Jack stood to protect Dixon and make sure he couldn't pull any more tricks. Jack tightened his grip in the holding area as he watched the once smiling informant being escorted into an interrogation room. Feel the weight of Dixon's representation on Max's harness. He wasn't just a criminal. He was the key to exposing a corruption network that extended well beyond their little group. Ruiz put a comforting hand on his shoulder and whispered, "We've got him. Now we'll force him to speak in the interrogation room." Despite his previous terror, Dixon's smugness had made him relax back in his chair with his cuffs clinking against the metal table. He added in a low, slow voice, "I could make things very easy for you. All I want is one thing in return." Dixon laughed. "You're not exactly in a position to negotiate," Ruiz said, raising an eyebrow and crossing her arms. "A man in mind. There is always leverage in a situation where you want the names, accounts, and proof." Ruiz left the room and joined Jack in the observation, "But I want immunity and witness protection completely." She sighed in frustration. He's not going to back down without a deal. And sincerely, Jack, if what he says makes sense. Jack shook his head, his face unreadable. "But it might be worth it, because this could bring down some very powerful people behind his dark spectacles and the fate of the people he placed in danger." How do we explain Ruiz's hesitation if we let him walk? I don't like, any more than you do. But since we're discussing systemic corruption, Dixon might be the only person who can bring it to light. Justice isn't justice if we don't use it strategically. Jack turned to face her and spoke in a calm but forceful tone. "Damage its integrity. If we allow him to continue, we are no better than the system that we are attempting to correct." We completed examining the records when a cop knocked on the door and came in with a file detective named Ruiz. You'll want to watch Ruiz flip through the pages of the ambush, her expression becoming more solemn with each one. She murmured, "It turns out that these are financial documents. This is a list of accomplices." Ruiz gazed up her, and Jack's ears perked up, wondering what kind of accomplice she was. Grim criticizes politicians and even senior law enforcement, but this isn't. Jack nodded slowly. "But it's a national issue, therefore we have to take care of this. If Dixon finds out, he might try to destroy the remaining evidence," as they were getting ready to. Re-entering the interrogation room, Max tightened abruptly at Jack's side and growled softly. Jack's hand suddenly. He muttered, "What's it, boy?" as Max pulled on his harness, guiding Jack to the hallway. Ruiz. The dog stopped in front of a utility closet. His nose rubbed on her firearm as he instinctively followed her hand. Ruiz scowled against the door, indicating to two officers close to open it. As the door opened, they discovered a maintenance worker inside, struggling with a tiny gadget. His eyes widened in fear as Ruiz dropped the item and fled, giving it to Chase as Jack bent over to examine the gadget. "It's a burner phone," he muttered. Ruiz may have smelled the residue, since he brought the suspect back a little while later and saw him attempting to call someone, she suggested, most likely to alert Dixon with the fresh information and the call that Ruiz and Jack had intercepted. Returned to the questioning room, Dixon's smile wavered when he noticed their resolute expressions. With no other choice, Ruiz threw the paperwork on the table and stated, "We know about the courts and the cops to everyone here." Dixon leaned back to hide his discomfort, saying, "You don't have enough to bring. Dixon is not the only one who can provide us with answers." Jack went forward and spoke in a chilly tone, saying, "We have enough to bring you down without me. The question is," Dixon was truly concerned, and his confidence faltered under the pressure of whether you want to walk down alone for the first time. He clenched his teeth and snarled, "I'm not saying another word without a deal," referring to the weight of their combined pressure. Dixon's facts presented a sobering picture of conspiracy and corruption as he started speaking, and Ruiz recorded everything. Her pen flew over the paper, but the names were a price for the revelations. He stated that they were strong and would do all in their power to silence him and everyone who stood in their path. Jack and Ruiz were aware that time was running out, so they needed to act fast to get the evidence to her. Ruiz called her phone and stated, "We need federal backup to protect our team because they are bigger than us." Jack concurred, and just as Ruiz and Jack were completing their plans to transport, "We'll need to keep Dixon alive long enough to make it matter." A sudden uproar broke out in the precinct as Dixon was taken to a secure federal facility. The main entrance officers were the source of the distinct sound of gunshots as the lights flickered. Jack automatically crouched his hand as they hurried to answer to their radios, which were crackling with frenzied updates. Tightening Max's harness and asking, "What's going on?" Ruiz's tone was shrill and peaked. Her face is pale as she walks out into the corridor. Someone is attacking her and doesn't want Dixon. Jack's jaw tightened as he left the building. We must prevent them from touching him because he is the only person who can reveal this network. Max's ears pricked up as he pulled at Jack's as the officers established a defensive perimeter, harness indicating an impending danger. Jack immediately accepted the dog's intuition. "What is it, boy?" he inquired. Jack and Ruiz followed Max's direction and were led by the dog to the interrogation room where Dixon was being held. They discovered Max rushed, his strong jaws locking onto two armed guys who were trying to force the door open before they could respond. Ruiz raised her gun and took aim as the man screamed and dropped his weapon on one assailant arm. She growled, causing a sustained freeze that made the second man give up the rest. Although authorities were able to secure the area, it was evident that this incident was just the start and that Dixon needed to be moved immediately. Jack agreed as Ruiz remarked in an urgent tone that they wouldn't stop until Hyun was dead. "Agreed, but we need a diversion because they will pursue Max if they find out we're relocating him." Was standing next to Jack, his tail bouncing a little as though he was up for the challenge. Jack bent down and gave the dog a assuring pat. "It appears that we are in charge." The idea was straightforward but dangerous. A police escort would accompany the decoy vehicle as it left the precinct, attracting the attacker's attention while Jack Ruiz and Max would lead Dixon through a subterranean passageway to an unidentified van that would be waiting at the other end. The assailants followed the heavily guarded convoy, leaving the precinct strangely silent, and the decoy worked like a charm. Max was awake and prepared for anything as Jack and Ruiz led Dixon along the dark tunnel. But their relief was fleeting. Jack stopped halfway through the tunnel, and Max paused, growling low in his throat. Suddenly, "What is it, Max?" A shadow passed in front of them, and then the metallic. A sneering voice said, "Looks like the party came to us." And Ruiz and Jack reacted immediately. Dixon cowed his confidence and hid behind the concrete walls of the tunnels. Max jumped into action out of sheer terror as bullets flew off the walls, and the dog quickly entered the fray thanks to his agility, and he disarmed one assailant with a quick, well-timed bite, making him a blur of motion during training. When the dust settled, Max provided Ruiz and Jack with the opportunity they needed to eliminate the remaining threats. Jack knelt down his hands and came back to his side, his tail wagging triumphantly despite a minor graze on his flank. Trembling as he examined the wound, he whispered, "You're a hero, Max," in an emotionally charged voice. At last, the team came out. The unmarked van was waiting for its conclusion, battered but victorious from the underground. As the van roared off, they hurried Dixon inside and secured him for the trip to the federal institution. Ruiz looked at Jack and said, "We did it. He's safe for now." Jack nodded, placing his palm on. "Max thinks that although we haven't left the woods yet, this is a beginning for the ride." Dixon started talking about how his dread of his assailants outweighed his allegiance to them, including names, locations, and financial. Ruiz recorded everything with her pen flying, with each revelation presenting a more sinister image of corruption. Jack listened carefully across the page, his mind racing. If even half of this is accurate, he stated that it would be sufficient to bring down an empire. A few hours later, the squad reached the government facility. Dixon was placed in safe custody, and the task force was immediately informed of the significance of the days. As Jack and Ruiz got ready to leave an agency, things started to improve as they recognized the consequences of their actions. "Your work today saved lives," he stated as he approached them with a serious attitude. "We'll handle it from here." Officers gathered at the precinct to commemorate Max's heroic actions. Jack bravely stood aside and showered him with care and treats, a unique. "He earned it," Jack murmured quietly to Ruiz, with a smile on his face. "He always does." Max sat as the energy of the day slowly gave way to tiredness during the trip back to Jack's small flat. The dog's serene manner in the passenger seat, with his head resting on Jack's knee, stood in stark contrast to the mayhem they had. Jack reached down and ran his fingers over Max's fur after escaping. "You never," he whispered. "Let me down, buddy." Max gave a gentle tail wag in response. Ruiz's voice shattered the silence, demonstrating his everlasting allegiance. "Jack, you accomplished something. Amazingly, you risked your life today for everyone in that precinct, not just for justice. Jack offered I couldn't have done it without Max, who is the true hero. Jack nodded slightly and looked thoughtful the next morning. Got a surprise call from the precinct Ruiz, and the enthusiasm in his voice told me to get down, Jack. Jack hesitantly consented, and as his interest grew, he and Max arrived at. There was a lot of excitement around the station as a group of officers and media welcomed them. With pride, Chief Ramirez held a plaque that read, "Jack Max, this department owes you a debt," in the middle of the gathering. "Thank you for starting your actions yesterday, which not only guaranteed justice but also saved numerous lives," he said. The audience cheered when the plaque was delivered, praising Jack and Max's courage and willingness to accompany him. Outstanding service, Max, was the highlight of the commendation ceremony, which went beyond Jack's bravery. Officers related tales of his previous adventures, each of which demonstrated the dog's bravery, intelligence, and steadfast devotion as Jack watched and heard the praise he received. When asked how much Max had influenced his life, Jack responded, "He's not just my partner. He is, in a sense, my family. And yesterday he reminded me that there is always a way to succeed, even when the odds are against you. Fight back." Jack and Max turned into local heroes in the days that followed. The community came together in support of the tale, which made headlines and highlighted the value of police canines and their handlers. Then, with offers of assistance flooding in. One such offer was from a retired police rehabilitation facility and military dogs, inviting Jack and Max to come and suggesting a collaboration to assist in training the upcoming generation of canines. For Jack, heroes, it was a chance to transform his hardships into something worthwhile. "Max and I have experienced he told Ruiz that it would all be worthwhile if we could assist others in finding their path. In the afternoon, Jack was strolling Max in the park when a little kid and his mother approached him. The youngster paused before speaking. He asked, his eyes wide with wonder, "Jack, is this the dog from the news?" Grinned, "Yes, that's Max." The child is crouching and softly touching Max. He's really courageous. The boy's words, "You can be," caused Jack's chest to constrict with emotion. "You can be," he responded quietly, stated that it simply requires a great deal of heart and perhaps a little assistance from a friend. That evening, as the sun went down, Jack sat on his, with Patio Max by his side. The distant metropolitan skyline glistened, serving as a reminder of. Jack took a deep breath as the burden of the past finally lifted from the world they had battled so hard to defend. Had discovered a new mission that transcended both his blindness and his badge. And with Max at his side, he couldn't confront Jack and Max's tale, which is one of tenacity, devotion, and the unbreakable link between people and animals, serving as a reminder that kindness and bravery may. If you are moved by their journey, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our Watch the channel for more amazing tales and occasionally recall the greatest heroes. See you in the next one, and walk on 4 legs.